Hey everyone. Okay. Thank you all for coming out on a Tuesday night. I know you guys are really interested in beer later, so I'm not going to try to speak for super long. What I'm here to talk to you about is a JavaScript framework that I work on called Enyo. If any of you have watched, I talked about this a bit last year at JSConf and TXJS. At that time, Enyo was very closely tied with webOS. I was one of the architects, or kind of one of the key people working on webOS at Palm and then HP. Well, since that time, the fortune of webOS hasn't necessarily been as good, but the good news is that we've committed to open sourcing everything, and so part of this is open sourcing our JavaScript frameworks and building it out to make it something really great for everyone. So, starting out with, here's our brand new logo. If you see, there are some stacks of stickers here on the main table. If you want to grab some, please do. I don't want to take any of these home. So Enyo, what does it mean? I mean, first off, the name comes from, I think, Greek mythology. Enyo was the god of war, same as Ares. Actually, the name came because we had done a tool called Ares, which was an IDE, and Enyo is Ares' brother. That's right. So, like, hey, we need a JavaScript framework to go with this IDE. Let's continue the theme. So, why do we come up with the whole Enyo framework? Basically, we had a mandate. We need 500 applications for the touchpad stack. Seriously, I mean, we developed some frameworks for webOS. We've done things for all these phone form factors. Then it came time to do a tablet device, our touchpad. And the code that we had just wasn't going to work well. It was designed for a little tiny screen. We needed to scale up to a bigger screen. And it was kind of designed around the idea of a lot of lists, moving through a list, picking an item, going deeper, picking another item, going deeper. And, like Apple showed with the iPad, suddenly you have a bigger screen you're carrying around. The metaphors you use for the UI just don't map the same way. So we took Enyo as a chance to do a fresh start for our JavaScript framework. And so it's like, okay, we need a new framework. The next question is, what do we want to do with it? We have a lot of programmers inside of HP. Most of them are not HTML and CSS experts. They're experts in lots of domains. They may be experts in database systems, experts in customer relations, all these things. But we want a system that they can actually use to build applications that will run in the web. And the web is really important. webOS was built around the idea of a web browser being the user interface for your device. Mozilla has this new Boot to Gecko project that's very similar, the idea that you're pushing the web down onto the mobile devices you have. And when we came up with this, it's like, hey, we're going to embrace the web technologies, we're going to run with it. And now that we're pushing this technology out to a wider area, we're still using the web, using the browsers that you all know and love as our application delivery mechanism. So the next question is, how do you achieve this goal? How do you make a framework that random programmers can use? And the idea that we settled on basically kind of came out of what we did in the IDE is components. If any of you were programmers in the 1990s, you may remember a little language called Visual Basic. Nobody really liked Visual Basic, but it was huge. At one point, it was the most popular language in existence. And the reason why it was so popular was because you had kind of a visual designer that let you draw out an application. And you had these big library of components, this chunks of code that you can pull in, and maybe they were a button or a chart display. Maybe it was an invisible component that just did something like talk to your own local database system. Components aren't sexy. Components aren't MVC frameworks. They aren't templating engines named after facial hair. But you know what? They work. You can build real applications with them, and they're a great way to reuse a lot of pieces. So coming down to like where we're going, this is kind of like what the vision of the original Enyo 1 was. Components to build applications for tablets. Well, now we're moving into this new era. We have lots of targets for this. One thing about Enyo is that it's designed to be cross-platform. We're looking at building apps for desktop web browsers. We're looking at building applications that run on iOS and Android in the web browser, or maybe inside a PhoneGap. We're looking at the future of what's going to happen with webOS as it gets open source, and how do we build applications for that. And then we have whole new platforms like Windows 8 that are coming out that are based around HTML and JavaScript, at least as one of their application models. And we want to figure out how we can build something you can use to build applications for that you can also then repurpose for all the other places that you need to run apps. So another big aspect of Enyo, we're an open source project. Back in the webOS days, we were proprietary. You could only use them on webOS devices. In January, we released all the code to the original Enyo 1.0 as Apache 2.0. Apache 2.0 is basically one of the most permissive licenses. It says do whatever you want to with the code. You just have to attribute it to the original authors, and you can't assert patents against people, basically. I'm not a lawyer. My wife is a lawyer. She would tell me not to give you legal advice.
She's not.
Actually, she is. She's right there. That's why I pointed to her. All of our sources on GitHub, github.com/EnyoJS. If you want to explore this, EnyoJS.com is actually kind of the best starting point. And I'll switch over to, this is our website. It's kind of really ugly. The rest of the session, I'm just going to be reading straight from the website. I'm not. But this is EnyoJS.com. It has lots of download links and more information. And switch back over to here. Okay. So that's kind of the getting an idea of what's going on here. Let me talk about the parts of Enyo. One of the reasons I was really excited to talk to AustinJS is that the audience here is a bunch of people that know JavaScript. Many of you forwards and backwards, some of you maybe just forwards. And so I'm really kind of excited to get into a bit of what makes up this. If we switch over to my text editor here, actually I have the source code to the framework sitting in this panel. So we have, all these different directories full of files. When you actually use it, you generally use it in a minify form, so you just include a single JavaScript file and a single CSS. But you can also use it in this expanded form, and you can debug into it. The first big section is what we call boot. Now, boot is really just a loader. If you use things like require.js, it's very similar. The idea is that your application can have a bunch of these package.js files. A package.js lives in a directory of source. And it just lists, here's an application source file. Maybe you have lots of different components. You have lots of JavaScript files. You also can put CSS files here. And when it processes it, it's going to pull the CSS by adding a link tag in here, HTML source. We also have that $lib reference. What that is $lib refers to a library directory. We're really big on the idea of having libraries that extend our core. I think kind of borrowing an idea from things like jQuery, where there's a core bit of functionality that provides a very well-defined set of things, but then there's all these add-ons, all these plugins that people have done to extend it. And in fact, what I have here is $lib/Onyx. Our UI library, which is called Onyx, is actually just another library that extends Enyo. So you don't have to use our UI library if you don't want to. You can just use the core. So anyway, the package.js files, it's actually just JavaScript. Enyo depends as a loader for all these things. Not a big deal. Next library is kernel. Kernel is where we actually get into the meat of what the Enyo class library is. And probably the most important part of Enyo is what we call Enyo.kind. Enyo.kind is a constructor factory. So if you know your JavaScript, you know that you can create a function, and that function will assign things to this variable, and you can use it by saying new function call, and you basically get a new object that's been constructed that way. And so lots of JavaScript libraries take the idea of how do we generate these constructors in a really useful way. So let me show you an example. Here's a kind definition in Enyo. What I've done here is, inside the Enyo kind function call, I pass an object. This is basically a big prototype object that I'm going to be using to create a constructor function. Now the name of it I've given here is tv.newgirl. Yeah, I'm just trying to find some nice pop culture things to wrap our minds around. One thing interesting about this is that if you see the name has a dot in it, so what it's actually going to do there is it's going to first see if there's an existing TV namespace, basically a TV object. If there's not, it's going to create the TV object. Then it's going to stick new girl as an item inside that namespace. You don't have to use it that way. It's just, I was going to show you a nice bit. The next line there is kind television show. This is where the kind concept actually comes into its own, because kinds in Enyo are very much like classes in standard object-oriented languages. We don't use the word class because it's overloaded. Class is already used in CSS to refer to the different kinds of groupings of styles. It's also a reserved word in JavaScript, so we couldn't use class anyway. So kind is what we do here. And what we're saying here is that we're basing this on an existing kind called television show. What that means is that this constructor is going to be producing objects that have all the things that television show objects have, plus whatever we're adding in this. And so the last thing we have here is we're defining a method called show. And the interesting thing here is that this inherited. In JavaScript, it's traditionally been really hard to do this kind of inheritance thing where you want an overridden function to be able to call its parent. So what we did here is this inherited, basically every kind constructed object has an inherited call. You call inherited, it looks to see what calls it, and then uses that to figure out what super kind to call. So basically, my call to this inherited there is going to call the television show.show function. And arguments just means I pass in whatever arguments I had originally. And just to show you, it's a constructor. We come around, we create a new girl object, assign it to ng. So, Enyo-kind. Enyo-kind is devoted to doing inheritance and kind of creating constructors. Now, any object system needs a good base, and so that's where Enyo object comes in. This provides property for publishing. So what we have here, I'm just creating another kind. I'm basing it on the Enyo object kind, and I'm calling it UPC. This is going to be a UPC code type object. And then I have this array published, and in it I provide a product ID variable. Now the idea is that anything you put in published is considered a published property. That means that when we create this object, we automatically create a set, a get, and a changed method for this. So I'm defining product ID changed here. So anytime anyone modifies product ID using set product ID, this change call is going to be called. And I'll use that as an opportunity to look at the new value that got changed and maybe modify some other properties inside my object. The other thing interesting here is this create call. Create is automatically called by the constructor of my object. And this is where you put any code you basically want executing whenever your object's originally created. And so in order to basically do whatever housekeeping I do, I call product ID changed here. And if we look at some code that created a UPC object, the first one is using the fact that a kind constructor can be passed in an object of things to override. So we're saying we're creating a UPC object and we're going to set the product ID value to begin with. And then afterwards, I call set product ID to change that, and I can call get product ID to get the value out. This property system can be really useful, especially when it comes to building up whole hierarchies of objects, and just being able to manage in a convenient way all the things being modified in your system. Okay, we're going to go one level down here. Enyo component is the next thing. So we have a constructor, we have properties on these objects. Component is what gives you the ability to put a bunch of these together. So in my new kind definition, I'm creating a Sith Lord based on Jedi. Now, you don't see me, at this point we're assuming that Jedi is based on Enyo component or somewhere down the tree it is. What that means is we can create this events hash. And events are basically, you can call an event by doing things like, here we do this do speak. And that means that on the owner of this object, it's going to call an event handler, and the event's going to go all the way up the parent chain. We also have the ability to send events down the chain. So eventually you end up with this whole tree of components, and the way to communicate back and forth is by either sending events up or sending events down. Some of these events might be based on DOM events. They don't have to be. They can be entirely synthetic, and I'll show you how that works a little later. So we have our Sith Lord. We have a scream method, and if you call scream, it's going to send a message up with a whiny tone. So now here's a case of where we do some aggregation. Inside of this kind, we have a components array. And the components array is basically saying, so our Sith Lord's object owns 3 Sith Lords. Darth Vader, Emperor Palpatine, and Darth Sidious. And so for Darth Vader, we're specifically listening for his speak event. But whenever that event comes up, we're going to call our listen to toys code. And the listen to toys code is going to do an alert with that message. So if we come around and we create some new Sith Lords, we set a weapon on Darth Vader, we throw Palpatine into a pit, and then finally scream, "No!" That's going to basically cause the event to go up, and we'll catch it at a higher level, and all be great in the Star Wars universe. Okay, so that's kind of the core of Enyo's object model. We have constructors, we have properties, we have events, and we have this ownership tree. The kernel also provides the UI component. This is just a base class for dealing with things that are eventually going to be shown in the web browser. And I'll be talking about the main one of those, Enyo Control, in a moment. We also do a UI component based on Canvas, and since Canvas kind of behaves differently inside of it, we had to do this abstraction. We also have Enyo Signals, where it's what we use to create app-level events. So like things that normally would be firing on your document or window, you could create an Enyo Signals object stored inside your object, and that's how you tell the system you want to listen for those big high-level events. The kernel also has a bunch of utilities, some logging, wrappers around set timeout, animation code, templating code, a bunch of stuff that we have done meeting in our own applications. Okay, so the next level is DOM, and switching back over to my editor here. Yeah, we have a bunch of code in DOM for doing things like gestures, for dispatching events, but the big one I'm going to talk about is control. So Enyo controls are our engine for rendering HTML content. Let's look at one. So what I've done here is I've created a bumper sticker. The bumper sticker is based on Enyo control. The tag indicates what HTML tag this is going to render into. So the default is div. Whenever you render control, it's going to have a div and it's going to have some content inside of it. But you can put whatever tag you want to. You can actually make a whole tree of these to represent your HTML tags. Or you could end up just putting some HTML content inside of it. And eventually that content will be put into the middle of the tree. Controls also support styles. So we've gone here and directly set like a color blue and a font size style on this. But then the key thing here, we create our bumper sticker, and at the very end we do a render into. What render into is it names a DOM node, in this case document body, and then it's going to go through the control of all the objects that control owns and build up this big tree of HTML. All the tags, all the attributes, all the internal content inside those tags. And then it's finally going to stick it into document body using the inner HTML property. So in this way, we can define all these components, all these buttons and lists and menus and things, and then with one render into call, we generate all the HTML and stick it into our live web page. And then once it's in the live web page, we've hooked up all the events, and then it just is running like you loaded the page straight off the web. Another part of the DOM area is dispatcher. We've taken all of the standard DOM events, things like mouse up, mouse down, input events, various kind of window activation, focus, and we have basically, we're catching them at the top of the application and turning them into Enyo events. So you don't have to go and hook the events on the actual objects you create. Instead, you can use the Enyo dispatch system for this. So an example here, what I've done here, I kind of eliminated a few things. By default, Enyo kind is going to create controls for you. So if you don't specify a kind, you're going to use the default kind of Enyo.control. So I didn't have to specify it. I didn't have to specify the tag because it defaults to div. So created my bumper sticker again. This time I gave it a tap function. And tap is automatically hooked into the action of moving the mouse or the finger over it and pressing down and lifting up. So if I rendered this bumper sticker now and I clicked on it with my mouse, I'd get the code running inside the tap function and I'd get the someone bump me alert showing up. Next area is AJAX. We have code for dealing with AJAX, XHRs, JSON-P. It looks kind of like this. Enyo AJAX is actually based on our Enyo object rather than component. So you don't store AJAX objects inside your own kinds, you just have them as instance variables. But you can create a new one, you can tell it to fetch a URL from a certain location, and then you can chain various responses, either positive ones like API OK here, or negative ones like API fail. And you can either keep chaining them out, but finally what's going to happen is that .go method is going to trigger it to actually start creating the low-level XHR object, getting the browser to start fetching your content, and eventually at some point in the future calling your responses. We have an area called UI. When we started working on the Onyx widget set, we found that there was kind of two kinds of code we had. We had code which was going to be common for dealing with these HTML tags, no matter what kind of theme or top layer you wanted to put on it. And we had code which was specific to the theme that we were doing. So this is just a collection of wrappers around a lot of these standard things you're going to want to do, no matter what kind of user interface you have. So dealing with the button tags, checkboxes, groups of items. Repeater is a kind which actually lets you duplicate content multiple times. So you could do a control like listing all the tweets you've gotten from a Twitter fetch. You could put that into a repeater and it would handle doing the iteration through things. I'm not going to go into detail on this because I'll be getting into UI in a moment. And then finally, another big area of the framework is touch. So given the heritage of us starting out on the touch pad, we do a lot of work with scrolling. Enyo Scroller is a particular kind of control that you can put other content into. It's kind of like the 10-pound bag when you only have a 2-pound view. So one of the problems that people have traditionally had with things like iPad, Android tablets, phones is how do you show all this content and how do you scroll through it effectively? We've been basically looking at all the different alternatives out there, whether it's using 3D transforms, which works pretty well on modern devices, just modifying the scroll DOM value, which works better on older ones that don't have the CSS transformations. Trying to figure out how to apply physics, so if you move your fingers quickly, you'll get a bit of inertia and things will keep scrolling for a moment. All of these kind of things is what we handle inside Enyo Scroller. And we actually look at what browser you're running on and figure out what the right scroll strategy is. So if you're running on a desktop system, then intercepting the scroll wheel is important, but having all the physics behind the moving through a list isn't. Whereas on a tablet, you want to have that smooth tracking of the fingers and be able to handle the touch events. So that code does that for you. And now, so that's the core of the Enyo framework. You can take this chunk of code and use it to build applications. We have an API viewer that's just built with this. We have a bunch of samples that are just built with this. But when people were using Enyo 1, they were very used to us having a very rich library of controls. And so Onyx is what we have next. So if you're going to think of Enyo as the core, like a jQuery, then Onyx is our jQuery UI. So Onyx comprises of some CSS themes, a bunch of JavaScript behavior, and a bunch of composite controls. What I mean by composite controls is something like a pop-up, where the pop-up has a div, but then it also has modal behavior, so that when the pop-up is on screen, other stuff gets dimmed out, and if you tap outside of it, it'll dismiss it. Or toolbar is a composite control, which owns a lot of buttons and has kind of a behavior where you can move it around the area. We have a sample on our website called Onyx Widget Sampler. And so this is just kind of a quick guide to show you, like, here's the whole collection of controls that we have. Buttons, tab groups, radio groups, text areas, inputs, progress, sliders. And this was just us getting started. I mean, this was basically our original set of widgets that we produced. Right now we're in the middle of implementing the infinite list widget, also implementing some panels and just big ways of organizing your application. There's one other area which I don't have in my slides, but I want to show you an example of, which is called layout. And layout is, let's see if I can get to it here in the browser, because I don't think I had a lot of luck with the web. Well, if you go to here and see, layouts is our library attempt to figure out how to fit things together into a web page. So one of the big problems that we have in building an application is web pages are designed to be scrollable. They're designed for you to have content, and you keep going down, you get more and more content until you get to the end. Well, in applications, you tend to want things like a toolbar at top, controls at the bottom, maybe a scrolling area in the middle, maybe widgets over here on the side. You kind of want to divide up your window into lots of different areas. CSS traditionally hasn't let you do that very nicely. You have things like floats that can get you part of the way. There's things like flexible grid layout that's implemented in WebKit that can get you there. We have a fittable layout library which goes and it uses CSS when possible, but then sometimes manually sizes things in order to give you the ability to kind of naturally place controls on the sides and then have an area in the middle, either vertically or horizontally, that scales to meet your screen size. So for something like, let's see, one of the applications I've written using Enyo is a cryptogram game here. So with this, I have some controls at the top. I have a bunch of buttons that are grouped together using the Enyo components. This is a big component here, and this is actually, I have a cryptogram item here in the middle. Inside of it are a bunch of cells, which are their own Enyo kinds. Whenever I hover over a cell, the mouse over event is being intercepted by that cell. It's turning it into an event that it sends to all of its siblings, saying, I'm hovering over the letter L, for example. So which is what allows, basically me to do the hover over for all of the like letters as they move across here. If you tap on a letter, it's going to send an event up saying the user wants to guess for letter K. Now we have an Onyx pop-up that shows up showing us K and asking for what. And then if I hit like P to guess that, then it sends a guess back down by doing another event broadcast back into all the cells saying, hey, if you happen to be the crypto letter K, show the guess P. And if I change something else, like I want N to be P instead, then it's going to, those ones that were P before get that same event and say, oh, I need to unset myself now. This is all using the Enyo events to kind of both push information up from the individual cells low in my hierarchy, but then push information down from basically the app object that's controlling everything. And I also have this hint, which kind of sends more things like do actual guesses. This one, it basically builds the cryptograms off of Twitter messages people have made, which means that most of these are really inane. Okay, so another bigger sample we have is API Viewer. If you look at our Enyo source code, you'll see that we have a lot of comments. Well, we don't have a lot of comments. We have some comments here that describe what all these different properties, methods do. And so we built a live API viewer that reads the source code straight out of the tree, parses all the comments out, and then provides a view for you to browse it. So going back here to Chrome and switching to API viewer. Yeah, so this has all been generated dynamically, but on my local machine from the copy of the Enyo source code that I have now. So if I went and made changes in here, then I could go and see those. And this is all managing, like this area here is a component, this is a toolbar of components, tapping on a button changes the content here, using messages. So another example of an Enyo application. We have a really nice community gallery. So based on the legacy of us doing webOS, we already had a fair number of developers that knew Enyo when we decided to open source it. And what we've done is we created a special repo in our GitHub called Gallery. And Gallery is just an application that shows you components that have been contributed by people in our community. And if you build a new component and want to share it, you just go and you do a pull request against our JSON file and upload an image with that. We handle the pull request every day, and suddenly the gallery is updated through the magic of GitHub pages with all the new things people have done. We opened this about 3 weeks ago. So far we have about 24 different submissions of everything from accordion controls to database management systems, lots of different date time pickers, things that we haven't got a chance to build ourselves in the Enyo framework team, but we're really excited about seeing the contributions from people out there. But we have a really active developer forum. I'm on there 3 or 4 times a day answering questions. We also have some of the other core developers in the group that are answering questions, and lots of people out there that have been developing things. If you want to know how to use PhoneGap to package up an Enyo application for the iOS store, there's a topic there with 50 messages on it now. We're kind of building up this big base of knowledge about how to use this to build apps and how to get the apps out to mobile devices. We have a blog. It's hosted on Tumblr. Sorry, but we're trying to get a lot of information here. We're using it both for technical posts, things like talks like this one, but then also we're using it to promote our application developers. So if you built up an application with Enyo and got it published, we'll highlight it here, and other developers or people that are just fans of the framework of webOS will get a chance to see it and see it spread on all sorts of different platforms. We're active on Twitter, Enyo.js. My own Twitter handle is unwiredbin, and we have half a dozen people on our team that are responding there as well. So that's basically what I wanted to show you today. We have a tutorial if you want to go through step by step and build up a Twitter search client. If you have any questions, I'll be around at the Ginger Man later, and I'm also on our dev forums answering stuff all the time. So thank you very much.